63% of the world's population lives in areas where the fertility rate is no longer high enough to renew the next generation. That's up from 45% just 2 decades ago. This according to a survey conducted by the French Demography Institute, INED. The survey paying particular attention to not population by country, but by regions. Well, for more, we can cross at this point over to Mélanie Chanon, reader in social policy at the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
This study that's come out points to a birth rate that's slowing, perhaps even faster than we thought. It's been a big topic of conversation in this country, as we'll hear in a moment. Surveys which I'd seen a few weeks ago showing that the population on this planet due to decline before the end of the century.
So yes, you're correct that the UN projects population decline will begin maybe around 2086. But that's a very long time off. And it's a projection. It's not that we know that will happen, because obviously there are an awful lot of things that might happen between now and 2086. I think the other thing to say is that the UN projects that the population will peak at potentially over 10 billion. And at the moment, we only have 8 billion people on the planet. So we are looking at quite a substantial population increase before we see any real decrease.
Yeah, it depends how you parse the numbers, because on the one hand, they're talking about 2.3 children per household in this study. 2.1 is the minimum threshold if you want to renew generations. And then, of course, you look at other surveys, and actually the population just is increasing by a huge amount, like something like 9% over a decade.
So I think we're generally agreed that the average number of children that women have worldwide is around 2.3 now, which is indeed only just above the 2.1 that you would need to keep the population stable. But I guess the question is whether you would actually want the population to be stable at 8+ billion people, which is far more people than we've had for the majority of human history. I would say there's potentially not a big issue with the population declining just in terms of raw numbers.
Not a big issue with the population declining in terms of raw numbers, but it's become a political issue. And the case in point being here in France. Recently, we had the president pointing to a slowing fertility rate. And Emmanuel Macron, in his remarks, coined the expression of the need for a demographic rearmament. Let's take a listen.
Male and female infertility has progressed a lot in recent years and is causing a lot of couples to suffer. A major plan to combat the scourge will be launched to enable this very demographic reset.
So, a French president who clearly wants more babies, not fewer. Your reaction listening to that clip?
So my reaction listening to that clip is the issue is when people aren't able to have the number of children they want to have. He's talking about infertility, which I think, because I only heard the translation, is referring to people not being able to have children when they want to have children. And that is a big problem, and that's very different from raw numbers. So, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, about 40% of women end their childbearing years having had fewer children than they actually wanted. And the figure's about 25% for other countries. So there are a lot of people who are not having as many children as they would like to have. There are also a lot of people having more children than they would like to have. So from my perspective, the issue is not the overall number of children that people are having. It's whether individuals are able to have the number of children they really want.
Yeah, and what this study shows is that this drop in fertility, it's not following necessarily the patterns we expect it to. Yes, in the developed world, we know all about that. We see the threat of population decline throughout Europe. In places, though, like India, when they broke it down region by region, they found that in the south, the population was declining much faster than thought.
Yes, well, I mean, India is really a continent in and of itself. It has over 1 billion people. I think it's now the largest country on the planet. So unsurprisingly, when you break it down into those smaller segments, you will see enormous differences by state. And the southern Indian states have historically always had lower fertility. The northern Indian states, they have much stronger son preference. And part of the thing that is driving higher fertility in those northern Indian states is that people will sometimes keep on having children until they have had a son or the number of sons that they want.
Is it a set rule? If you've got a larger middle class, you'll have fewer children?
I mean, that's generally the pattern, yes, that the middle classes have fewer children. But in very high-income countries, very rich people actually have slightly more children because they can afford them.
Yeah, that's what's been found here in France. They talk about a demography in a U-shaped demography where the poor and the rich have a lot of children, but not the middle classes.
Yeah, that's precisely it. And that's a very common phenomenon.
Now, there's this, you touched upon it earlier in our conversation, Mélanie Chenon. There is I guess the big debate here about when you hear the French president talking about the drop in fertility, he talks about as well when his notion of demographic rearmament. He's also thinking about France's growth. If you have fewer children, ultimately the country's growth rate will drop, which is bad for business but good for the environment.
So yes, and France is absolutely not the only country worrying about what it means, I guess, in terms of, power and business and GDP if you have fewer people. In fact, 70% of world population governments have a policy on wanting more children or fewer children. And very few of them have been successful in managing to manipulate their fertility rates. So I think that governments would be much better off worrying about how they can plan for the population that they do have and that they will have, rather than attempting to manipulate it.
How do we frame the conversation differently so that we're not always obsessing about GDP, about the growth figure?
How do we frame it differently? Well, for me, it's about thinking about individual human rights. How can we ensure that the people who live in France, in your case, in the UK, in mine, and in any other country in the world, how can they enjoy a good life with everything that they require, but not, with excessive levels of consumption?
Mélanie Chenon, so many thanks for joining us from Bath.
Thank you.
Stay with us. There's much more to come. More news plus the day's business. And in sports, South Africa relishing its biggest football success in years, dare we say decades. Jaime Jamin will have that story.